Okay, fine. Thank you. So I'm just going to fade it down. Everything looks like it's going okay. Oops. And still the weaver plies the loom, whose warp and woof is sleeping man, weaving the unpatterned dark design, so dark we doubt it owns a plan. Welcome to the Architects of Conscious Transformation. Previously, we had investigated a little bit of the ancient Minoan culture. The Minoan culture was famous for many things, especially for the labyrinth of Minos. And we had discussed the possibilities of what that meant. You know, less than a superficial treatment was given. More than a superficial treatment was given, I mean. And of course, the labyrinth, as it was originally built, was the pattern of lovers dancing. It was a love dance that the pattern of the labyrinth was based upon. And so it was really the coming together of complements, universal complements, in a dance of love. Now, what replaced that eventually was the story of the Minotaur, which was a man and bull hybrid, half divine, half human, who was planted there. And a hero, Theseus, eventually got into the labyrinth and destroyed it. But we mentioned that in order to really get into the heart of the labyrinth and go beyond it, the Minotaur, of course, is something that we face in ourselves. It isn't something outside, some kind of external monster. It's our own unconsciousness. It's our own reflexive, chronic defense mechanism. Against what? Against what? What would the chronic defense mechanism be against? What would it be defending? It would be defending against waking up to the unconditional state of consciousness, to the unconditional way of being, not a state, but beyond states, beyond anything that is limiting. And so, in a sense, the Minotaur, that chronic defense mechanism, protects our reluctance to awaken to the highest potential in ourselves. And so the Greeks composed a teaching drama, a teaching story related to this, that we, each of us, have somewhere within us, created by whatever circumstances we have allowed to happen in a way. This Minotaur, this chronic defense mechanism, is there within us, and we are, in effect, at its mercy, in a sense, because the Minotaur is at the very heart of our journey through what we call life or the phenomenal universe. And that Minotaur, when we leave life, can be waiting in an ambush to create not just what our next life form is, but our death form. The Minotaur is, in effect, the personification of all that is in us, which will make us take rebirth unconsciously. This is an ancient Mediterranean and Eastern idea. The Pythagoreans, which will be those members of a school called the Pythagoreans, led by Pythagoras, formulated the idea of reincarnation or metempsychosis, going from one body to another in order to complete our journey through existence. However, the successful completion really has to do with going beyond the Minotaur. And as we mentioned earlier, previously, the way that the Minotaur, the chronic, can be transformed and gone beyond is not through violence, through aggression, through killing, through destroying, but rather through impartial equanimity love. That is the true method by which the center of the labyrinth is gone beyond. The labyrinth vanishes because it is a magic thing. It is not real, not ultimately, but it basically is an obstruction to our true awakening. And so the Minotaur, even though it seems to be a monster in itself, is not doing anything other than its job, which we gave it at some point. And it is up to us to find the key, the way that we have constructed it, how we have constructed the labyrinth, and how we have basically armed the avatar with our own knowledge, our own secret knowledge of what will trip us up, as it were, at the moment of death. And so at the moment of death, if the chronic is present and it operates at that moment, it will basically create what is called our death form. Our death form is the form that we take through death into the next birth. So, the Minoans were the ones who created, or at least one of the cultures that created, the labyrinth and the teaching of the labyrinth, and constructed one, as a matter of fact, to illustrate it. This culture was perhaps the last culture in the Mediterranean Western cultures to have an all-out, you might say, a complete cultural recognition of the great goddess as the chief deity. And women and priestesses especially were highly regarded. They were the most highly regarded individuals in the culture. They had an extremely powerful position, and they were the initiators. And if you want to look at this and say this was about sex, it was. These priestesses were sexual initiatrices, and the males who were their consorts and their students would learn some of the deeper mysteries of tantric work with them. And as you can see, there was no reluctance to display the power and the force of the feminine sexuality through the imaging that was used. The snake goddess, so-called, was really holding the two genders in perfect control and in a posture of openness and openness to whatever new would come in, something great, something transformational. This is on the other side, the colorful one with the red tunic and the obviously huge breasts is the priestess, initiatrix, who has knowledge. It's interesting to note that the feet are very similar to some of the Egyptian style portraits, profiles of carvings and so forth. This painting has obviously two left feet. Two left feet kind of represented someone or an individual who was connected to divinity, someone who was in fact only able to be seen from the passive side of existence. We were only able to see the passive side of someone in terms of a deity, because the active side, which was hidden from us, was the one that created and caused things to happen in this universe. And so the two left feet actually made sense, because in some other portraits, especially if you see these priestesses in the Minoan culture, followed by worshippers, not worshippers, but people who, men who were giving full reverence and adoration to this manifest divinity, they had their feet portrayed in the correct way. They had left and right feet. So it wasn't an accident, and it wasn't that they couldn't draw things naturalistically. This was a message through the art that these individuals, as portrayed, were in fact somehow divine. and deserved the reverence of a divinity. So, they were obviously not afraid to show sex in this culture, and they were, in fact, using it as a positive form of transforming consciousness. Here we have, of course, then we went to the Greek culture, and one of the great discoveries geometrically was the golden section, and you can see it's a rectangle which, through just turning the sides, you can form other rectangles and they will turn into an infinite spiral. It's called phi, one of the great transcendental ratios discovered, or at least passed on to us by the Greeks. And the ratio is 1.618. And if you put it over itself, it becomes 0.618. And in effect, it's the only known ratio that is itself, no matter which way you turn it, upside down or right side up. And so phi became the operant ratio for all art and architecture in the ancient Greek cultures and in all the other subsidiary cultures influenced by the Greeks. And the other great proportion, or actually transcendental number, that was derived by the Greeks via the Pythagorean school was pi, which is basically the relationship of the diameter of a circle to its circumference. And the number that that gives you has in fact come down to this day and is still used in effect to test the speed of the fastest computers that human beings can make. So pi, which was sort of presented through the Greeks via the Babylonians and the Assyrians, and perhaps even the Egyptians, came from this very simple relationship, this relationship of a straight line to a circle, and that has continued to fuel us in terms of mathematical developments. This is one of the keystones in our mathematics, in human mathematics. Pi is one of the keystones, and so is phi, the golden ratio, the golden section. And so these two together have been an enormous gift given to us through the art, through the architecture, and through the mathematics and science. Now, the person I think that we all owe a great debt of gratitude to for the digital age is Pythagoras. It is Pythagoras whom we know stated that everything can be given a numerical value. Everything in nature, everything in the universe has a numerical value. So if you look at digital recorders, you look at anything digital nowadays, ones and zeros, those are giving attributes numerically to things that then are translated into images, into sound, into whatever, into holograms. That is the great message, one of the great messages of that super intelligent human being, Pythagoras, and we all owe him a great deal of gratitude for having discovered that and passed that on to us through his various works. And of course, this is another example of it. This is the interior of the rebuilt Parthenon in Nashville, Tennessee, and as we can see, it is in effect truly a magnificent construction. Of course, what the original looks like is more like rubble, but a lot of it, because it was unfortunately blown up during one of the wars. But this was what stood in the Parthenon. It was dedicated to Athena, the Virgin, Athena Parthenos, and this exact replica is once again a wonder to behold, because it uses the proportion of phi, the golden section, throughout. And the actual sculpture, I don't know if this one was done accordingly, but the actual sculpture was based on the golden section. And we saw that in some other models, like the Venus de Milo, used the golden section as a way of constructing it and demonstrating those transcendental ratios. The idea behind building these ratios and these numbers into architecture and into artworks and into whatever things they could produce, music, was to basically imbue these artifacts, these works, these transmissions with this sense of the divine that they associated with those ratios and those numbers. And so we went from the ancient classical Greeks to the Persians. Now, during the time of the classical Greeks, just before that, in Persia, a great teacher and prophet, Zoroaster, came onto the scene there and basically transmitted a huge amount of information about the nature of reality to the Persians of that time period. And from it, as I said previously, the notion of a duality, an absolute duality, was kind of passed on through them, through the Persians, because they adopted this idea of an absolute good, known as Ahura Mazda, and an absolute evil, known as Ahriman. Now, the point was, though, that the original teachings of Zoroaster did not have that. Okay? The original teaching of Zoroaster basically stated that Zurvan, which is what you see here, Zurvan was the all-creator, this unified being, Zurvan. It emanated, on the one hand, Ahura Mazda, and on the other hand, Ahriman. So basically, from one unified being came this positive and negative manifestation, or at least demonstration in reality. So what happens? Beings do, they adopt only parts of things, and they leave out the most important part, which was the fact that both of these individuals, Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, were emanations of Zurvan. And Zurvan was, in fact, this unified, undivided, non-dualistic being. It was the non-duality of reality that Zurvan represented. And from this, it's exactly like what the Chinese would call the Tao. But because certain rulers wanted to justify that they were good and they had the right, in fact, to conquer others, they used this idea of Ahura Mazda is on our side, the good God is on our side, and everyone who doesn't believe in us is now associated with the bad dude, the bad part, the so-called evil part, or the negative part, or the chaotic part, really, of reality, Ahriman. And so, of course, human beings justify whatever they wish, and they basically misuse the teachings that have been transmitted to them. But one of the teachings that was very important was this particular one, that it was, in fact, an emanator of the dualistic state, but it was far above it, and therefore was, in fact, senior to any idea of a dualistic aspect to reality. There is no such thing as duality in reality. It is only a, you might say, a secondary formulation of what reality is. The unified emanator, Zurvan, was therefore the supreme ultimate of this particular system of thought. And unfortunately, like I said, the monotheistic religions adopted the idea that the good would triumph over the so-called bad, or in fact order would triumph over chaos. But in fact, the truth is that they are equally the same. They are equally as powerful from the same source, and therefore they can never actually overcome one another. And therefore the real aim of the Zoroastrian teaching was to go beyond the light and the dark and arrive at that which transcended both, to go beyond negative, positive, and arrive at that which was beyond it, and maybe even beyond that. There was even something beyond that that transcended even the unity of being. And so we discussed that a little bit, and we went on to the Greeks again, the teachings of the Greeks that were passed on through Plato. The Greeks were able to create architecture that was based in some principle upon these, what are called the perfect solids. These are Plato's perfect solids. They represent states of being, states of reality. The tetrahedron, which is the triangle, the four-sided triangle, was representing fire. The cube represented earth. The icosahedron, the 20-sided figure with triangles, represented water. The octahedron, the pyramidal, the double pyramid, represented air. And the dodecahedron represented space or ether, and ultimately the universe. And of course the sphere represented the stage of what would be called the perfect state. The sphere represented perfection to the ancient Greeks, the classic Greeks, through this system. And so everything that was built in their constructions reflected these figures, these types of geometries, in order to get to the perfection. And so the Romans adopted this. The Romans took those proportions that we've talked about, phi and maybe even pi a little bit, and they put them into their buildings. They emulated the Greeks with the post and lintel, as you can see. The post and lintel represents just a supporting beam or column over which is laid another perpendicular to it, another flat slab, and basically the strength of the materials and gravity are the only things that are really at play in this kind of construction. And you can see up in the top cells there are even cement cells that were used by the Romans, and this is a library, and quite beautiful at that. Yeah, these were magnificent works of architecture, and they still have a profound effect on us. But the Romans took the idea of the Greeks and the idea of their amphitheaters, for example, and they expanded on them. They took the idea of the sphere, which the Greeks never really realized in terms of into a building. They did make these semicircular odeons and sometimes almost totally circular odeons with the point of focus, and we had talked about the actual function of these originally, at least in the times of the ancient Greeks, who were, of course, philosophers and mystics and initiates, and how they applied this particular form, the odeon, to a group of trained initiates in an esoteric school who would become fused into one conscious being through the process of singing, through choirs and sound, and through the principles of vibrations, basically altering the very structure of our molecules and our DNA. In fact, you might call this an attempt to consciously evolve through raising vibration. And that was the original intention of these odeons, because they are used for sound reproduction in a sense, but they're also used now for entertainment and for plays and all that stuff. But that's the use that that these odeons were adapted to afterwards. But the original intention was to basically transform en masse the consciousness of an entire group. And we talked about the master, mistress at the center of focus, who would direct the sound development of the choir, and how that process through sound, through oralizing, would in fact change the vibrational level of everyone involved, and everyone in fact would become permanently changed through this type of conscious work. And if you aren't doing it, you may not understand what that's about, but we did mention that it is the original intention. And then, of course, we took the idea of the sphere with the Romans and applied it to this masterpiece called the Pantheon, which is basically a sphere. The entire proportion and the measurements of it actually would be a sphere from top to bottom. And this sphere was the idea of the embodiment of perfection on this plane of existence. The idea of creating a sphere on Earth was to actually bring perfection here. Basically to allow those, of course, who with the correct training and reverence and consciousness would, in effect, be instantaneously transformed in the presence of such an existent, something that exists on the earth and yet is connected to something that is beyond. You know, the divinity, once again, the divine is in the earth. It is brought to earth, or at least the divine exists here as well. And it's a conveyor, you know, for humans to get into higher dimensions. And this has been demonstrated many places through the various pyramids in the Americas and in Egypt, and now here through this form, the great spherical dome of the Pantheon in Rome. And so that was the beginning, you might say, of something that occurred over quite a long period. But to go from the post and little to the curve, and then the Roman arch, and the sphere was, you know, a progression in evolution in terms of human ideas, in terms of human abilities to construct things. And so the Pantheon really is the major example of that transition zone from just flat and gravitational to something that was dynamic. The dynamic tension of a sphere allowed human beings to enter into more open spaces and into, you know, greater transferred, you might say, transferred expansions beyond our own imagining at that point. And the imagining that happened afterwards continued. Once the Roman Empire fell to the Vandals and all the other so-called barbarians that rushed in at the demise of that particular capital, the Rome, that was not the case. The Roman Empire didn't fall completely. The Eastern Roman Empire at Constantinople, that was established as another capital city by Constantine, continued to go, and it became what is known as the Byzantine Empire. And you can see the continuation of the Roman arch, the round arch of the Romans in this particular Byzantine example. I think it's at Aleppo in Syria, I believe. But this is an example of it, that the Roman engineering and architectural skill was continued in the Byzantine. And it went on to, you might say, the ultimate in expression with the Emperor Justinian. He took the example of the Pantheon, and then he created an incredible church that was to exceed everything else that had ever been done to that point. And it's called the Hagia Sophia. It's now in Istanbul, what is now Istanbul, formerly Constantinople. And the Hagia Sophia was a multi-domed structure with the Byzantine tile work, that the mosaic tile work that the Byzantine culture was so famous for beautiful work that has lasted till almost to the present, until the Muslim invasions of Suleiman finally wrested control from the Christian Greeks over to the Turkish Islamic forces. But this is the outside of it. As you can see, it's now got minarets, towers, to summon worshippers to the to prayer in the Muslim religion. But as you can see, there are multiple little domes and domelets that are ascending to the central dome in the middle, which at one time, as you can see a better view of it from overhead. This then represents the expansion of what the Greeks had begun in terms of the idea of multiple spheres of existence. The music of the spheres that Pythagoras said he could hear was passed on hundreds of years, many hundreds of years, actually closer to 900 or 1,000 years later. Justinian and his architects, builders, built this incredible edifice, the Hagia Sophia, devoted to divine wisdom. So it was the feminine principle of divine wisdom that this church originally, this beautiful domed cathedral, was dedicated to, and it is now a museum, and it has been altered by the Islamic architects of later times, well, in the last 500 years. But as you can see, the idea of having multiple planes of existence and multiple spheres of perfection, if you will, coming down to us from above and then just imbuing us, irradiating this expansion and this light and this beneficence, if you will, this compassionate outpouring from up above to us below is an example of the kind of ideas that were basically built into the architecture of these structures. So the Hagia Sophia, the divine wisdom, was in fact still a continuation in some form of the divine feminine. It got snuck in there. So the feminine was in fact exalted to the highest level in this particular edifice, but it was changed when the Mohammedans took it over. This is more like what was originally in the domes and in the hemispherical domes that were in the Hagia Sophia. This is from Sicily, but it would have a very stern-looking Christ Pantocrator, God, the All-Creator, basically looking down pretty implacably at you from above. It was a very serious kind of religious expression, this particular one. Not too much joy in this one at this point. And then there were, of course, the Virgin was exalted by the angels. So basically, a lot of these, a lot of the Byzantine cathedrals and churches were built in dedication to Christ and the Virgin, the Mother of God, as they called her, Mary. And you can see this is another example, once again, of a domed cathedral. This is the Church of St. Mark's in Venice, and this is the elevation plan of it. And now, of course, this is much later. But once again, it still follows that domed idea that the dome itself represents perfection. And so these spheres of perfection are, in fact, transmitters of the idea that somehow on earth we can realize perfection, that through our efforts, through some kind of effort that is part of our humanity, making these efforts only in a way that would be recognizable to each individual, are we able to realize this perfection. And so these pieces of architecture were meant to awaken, to remind us, and to urge us to realize this perfection. They're reminders of our, you might say, lost potential humanity, that this humanity that we have given to us, that we are a part of, is in fact a precious gift that we must use and utilize for perfection. And here's the interior. And so you can see the spaces are expanding. The incredible tile, mosaic tile, all in gold, is meant to the moving reflections as you walk through this place. Everything is a glitter. Everything is glistening and shimmering with light from above, and it is in fact a message about, in effect, our own inner nature, that we are glistening and shimmering with light, that we have to awaken, that we have to expand into. And so these great works of architecture transmitted that, among other things. And as you can still see, the round arches will only allow a certain level of elevation. You can only go a certain height with domes and so forth, because they really do want to collapse in on themselves after a certain amount of elevation, because of the weight of stone and so forth. So that's St. Mark's. And then even further east in Russia, you got the very beautiful and almost whimsical, such as in Moscow, the St. Basil's great cathedral. Inside it's not so open and light, but the outside was also meant to, in fact, evoke the sense of wonder, the sense of opening to something beyond one's everyday existence. So all of this architecture was meant to astonish and to dazzle, not so much, not related to the rulers, the political rulers, but more to a reality that was like this and more. This was meant to awaken in each human being the knowledge that there is something beyond just survival, beyond just our mundane existence. And so these works of architecture and art were in effect transmitting that information. There's more for us to do. Yes, indeed. So as you can see, it's meant to enlighten us, to awaken that inner fire, that inner light that recognizes such things and knows how to move toward these kinds of symbols, these kinds of markers on our journey through life. And inspiration is what it's all about. It's inspiring us to take our own evolution into our own hands. And here it is. So we went from, let's say, the Byzantine into now the Islamic, and this is Ottoman architecture, and this is one of the great mosques in Istanbul. But as you can see now, the architecture took what the Greeks had transmitted about the sphere, and they just went as far as they could possibly go with multiple domes, and the interiors also had at that point the beginnings of the pointed arches, which would allow higher and more open structures to be built. It wasn't really part of the Muslim architecture, but it was inherent in it in a sense. It was used as part of the corridor into the great mosque, but it wasn't necessarily totally integrated into it, as it would later be in Western Europe. But this is what you got. This is the idea of expansion and glory and rapturous ascension into some kind of divine focus, into some kind of divinity that is waiting for us to realize itself. Now, of course, this being one of the cultures of monotheism, it wasn't allowed for anyone to think that they could actually be this, except for a few mystics who got away with it, like Ibn al-Arabi. But it was a very dualistic approach at certain points, but you can see that the actual architecture and the art goes beyond the dogma. And in this way, much of the art and architecture that has been built has that ability. It takes us, it transports us, is able to convey us to realms that are beyond duality, beyond a separation between the so-called deity and ourselves as human beings. And so the expansion, using the idea of the dome, became more and more refined. The emblazoning of the Quranic verses into the very cupola of the top dome, and the message of the unity of God is everywhere in these structures. And the point is that when you see these images, the actual experience in reality is 100 times more powerful because of the way that these spaces act upon our own scale of being. And so that's the Shahzad Mosque coming up, I believe. And here you can see this incredible multiple layer of spheres of perfection upon perfection upon perfection, the idea of being swept away in rapture and ecstasy toward the divine. So these symbolic forms that humans have created have always had an effect because their intention was conscious. The intention behind them, of the builders themselves, of the architects themselves, far exceeds many of the dogmas that these incredible transformational works of architecture and art have been transplanted into. And then we go from, let's say, from Turkey, we go to Iran, to probably the most beautiful city in Iran is Isfahan. And the great mosques that are here are unspeakably beautiful in the way that they've been able to make use of all the geometries. Although the human form was not allowed to be used in Islamic architecture and art, geometry was allowed free rein. And so through these cultures, the Islamic cultures, the working of geometrical forms into the most diverse complexity was realized. There has never been anything rivaling this at all. The intricacy of the floral patterns on this incredible blue tile of Isfahan, the blue and the gold together just are astonishing to look at. And you can see this. I think I may have missed one. No, I guess not. This is the interior hallway of one of the corridors in the mosque, and you can see that the beautiful scroll work, which is floral in design, like the tree of life, the flower of immortality. All of these themes are woven into this hard material. This hard material, which is very, very beautiful tile work, and it's created in a way that I don't think has ever been rivaled anywhere else on the planet, Isfahan. So let's see some more of it. This is the dome from the Great Mosque in Isfahan, and this represents, in a way, the rapture of union with God. This is the divine communion, and it's meant to, as they say, blow everything away, blow the mind, blow the feelings, overload everything so that one completely surrenders. And a lot of what Islamic culture and Islamic teaching relates to is surrender. The essence, surrender to the absolute. And these works of architecture are intended to create that reflex. One is so overwhelmed by the beauty, one is so overwhelmed by the conscious intricacy. I mean, this isn't random, this isn't just dibble-dabbled on there, this is unique, and at the same time, it's not repetitious, it's in some ways asymmetrical, as we'll see, and yet everything seems to work perfectly in accordance with in accord with everything else. It's incredible work that has to be experienced to be understood more fully. And once again, you can see the scroll work, the divine scroll work, and then the merging into this golden light at the top, this golden invitation to enlightenment, to illumination in the absolute. And even more. You can't really, one can really appreciate the geometry, the work, the role of geometry in Islamic architecture and art when we look at these things. Can you imagine someone being able to think this through all the way, to design this kind of work? This is not the work of an ordinary mind. This is the work of a higher mind, who is then able to take what's in the mind and translate it to materials and to workmanship, so that it actually expresses what was originally in the mind. I'll leave it to you. Look at the look at this incredible calligraphy. These are once again passages, verses from the Quran, going into the mihrab, into the prayer niche, facing east toward Mecca, toward the goal of all enlightenment, all human life. The idea of being drawn toward merging with the source of creation. And everything is in perfect harmony. It's asymmetrical, as you can see. It's a script that is remarkable, to say the least. And everything is asymmetrical and yet perfectly balanced. True transformational art. And we need to, of course, examine other aspects of the art of the Islamic world. This is a carpet, a rug actually, a wool rug from Isfahan, the same place that the great mosque that we were looking at is from. But as you can see, the designs that were on the walls are now woven in wool carpets, and the intricacy and the patterning is unsurpassed. These are true works of art that actually are asymmetrical and yet also unique in every element. When you try and understand what it takes to create a rug like this, then you'll have to go to the the greatest work of rug weaving ever done, the Artibil, which is at the Victoria and Albert Museum. Now the Artibil has 26 million hand-tied knots in it, 26 million. And it's made out of the finest wool and silk. It's 34.5 feet by 17.5, I believe. And you first view the dynamic balances here on the large scale, and then go into the smaller details of it, and you'll see all these little shoots and everything else on the plants themselves as if they're living things. And the remarkable thing about this is that none of these patterns, if you go around them, none of them are copies. Each one of these petals and flowers and buds and all the vines, all twisting and turning, are in fact unique. They're not the same as the next one or the next one or the next one. So these are in fact asymmetrical, and yet they're in perfect harmony with each other. Now imagine this. We were looking at the central medallion, but imagine this. Imagine someone who could conceive of this, who could actually conceive of creating something like this. It took 17 years, apparently, to create this rug. And it had a twin. There were two of these made. And every bud, every flower on this was intended to bring the viewer into a direct revelation of our highest potential with the Absolute, if you will. It was meant to be an instantaneous awakening artifact. And if you see this in person, and if you're just able to be present with it, because you can't really comprehend it, it's too big. You can only look at the parts, but when you see the whole thing and just see what kind of presence and what kind of attention and what kind of consciousness it took to generate this, you will know that that's a human being like yourself. A human being created this. A human being with possibilities like you was able to generate this, and it leaves us with the information that we too, if we're open to it, can arrive at this kind of creation, this kind of transformation in consciousness, because it definitely took a transformation in consciousness to create this. Because if it transforms us now, imagine what it must have done to the creator of this, for the creator of this. Too much. And so we go there, and then of course we come back again from the east to the western sector of Islam, which this is in Spain. I think this is in Granada. And you can see the curved arches with the various stripings. Beautiful, beautiful, very delicate pillars holding up the arches. But as you can see, they're not very high, but once again, the complexity and the number certainly make up for it. And here is another view down the nave. And those curved arches, which were borrowed from the Romans by the Arabs and the Islamic builders, once again with their own stylings, all have the purpose of bringing the attention upward to an elevated state. Those patternings above us are intended to bring the attention upward, to bring something in us to realize there's some kind of ascension possible, and it automatically draws the attention upward when we look at this place, when we're inside of it. We automatically look up. And everything in the entire edifice was meant to transmit the idea that even on earth, this portal into the higher dimensions is possible if we create things that will be similar to it. Through sympathetic magic, through sympathetic resonance, these beautiful fountains representing the fountains of delight in paradise in the Muslim tradition, in the Islamic tradition, were built all over to represent the flow of consciousness into the divine and back again. The idea that there is, in fact, a conduit on earth into those realms. And so now this is, I believe, from this is the Alhambra, and once again the kind of artistry and the kind of complexity that is put into the art is meant, in a sense, when you look at it in terms of a whole, it's meant to overwhelm the mind. It's meant to overwhelm the ordinary in us. It is meant to throw us out of our ordinary states and into something that is open. In other words, surrendered to the information that is in this, which is, of course, based on that divine geometry that the Greeks transmitted to the Romans and also to the Arabs later. And the Arabs were the ones who really took what the Greeks had theorized about to the actual level of manifestation. They manifested what the Greeks had intimated in their divine geometry mathematics. And this wasn't only to structures, it was to entire cities. The planning of cities was based on this geometry. And so, very much like in ancient Egypt, this principle of taking someone into the higher dimensions by having them walk through similitudes on earth was the method that they used. It was a contact liberation. It was liberation through contact with the essence of something that, through the mathematics and the geometry, was believed to be divine, above and beyond ordinary existence, beyond death, and so on. And you can see there is, we can talk about these things, but there is a certain music, there's a certain rhythm to all of this. So you can see it. Everything that is in the books of architecture that we'll be discussing at a later date from Vitruvius, who was the architect of Augustus, and which was passed on to every architect that existed in the ancient world. It was expressed through this architecture, through this kind of work in terms of details of how things were laid out in relation to the winds, to the light. All of that was implanted into these works. And we'll see the real function of what an architect was in human existence. Architects were, in fact, you might say, the manifestors of the highest principles. So architects were very, very special beings under these circumstances. They didn't just build places. Now this is another version of Islamic architecture. This is an Agra. This is the mosque in Agra. And so we've jumped from the Spanish to the eastern end of architecture, at least at that time, in India, through the Mughals. And once again, you can see those floral designs, the intricate patternings, more of an Indian sensibility, the native Indian, but once again magnificent in its impact. The redness of the stone obviously meant to implant some sort of mood into the traveler through these spaces. And then we come to the great and well-known now mausoleum of the Taj Mahal. And some people consider it to be one of the most beautiful architectural pieces in the world. It is, in fact, unsurpassed in its simplicity and at the same time in its subtlety. Beautiful in terms of form, beautiful in terms of footprint. It's very, very much according to the divine geometry that the Greeks, the Romans, and then the Arabs, and the Islamic, and after that, anyone who was involved with the Islamic culture and religion would build. And so the Taj Mahal is considered one of the great treasures on the planet. It's true. And we can only take from it today what we are open to. If we're open to reading the secrets that are implanted in the stone, in the scroll work, it can all mean something of a higher level to us. It can, if we allow ourselves to learn of it. And please understand that much of what we see outside, all of what we see outside, was once within us. Remember, we started with caves and just a spheroidal little indentation and a wavy line. And then we've taken those principles, though, and we've created this. Still a spheroidal shape, but with more intricacy, with more detail. We've gone more deeply into the materials. We've gone more deeply into the expression. But ultimately, what we have done is revealed something of our inner humanity, of our inner nature. Never mind humanity, just as beings. Perhaps there is something beyond just being human in our beingness, in our own being. And so, here's the Taj Mahal. An incredible work of transcendent art, I think, in a way that can only be, I don't know, experienced. But even images of it are awe-inspiring. Just this perfection of balance. There's nothing you can say. And then we went on, in a sense, to India. India is a vast culture, and we're going to just deal with it a little bit at this point. This is the ground plan of the temple at Madeira. Now, the Indian architecture is still alive and well today. The ancient traditions have been preserved in that culture. They haven't been superseded by the monolithic structures of industrialized culture, at least not to as much a greater degree as in all the other countries in the world. So in India, the principles of creating these ancient temples has continued. And so what that ground plan relates to is this. This is an ancient temple, and you can see there's layering, and once again there's pillars, but they're not very high, there's not much light. It's once again post and lintel to a great extent. And corbelled vaulting, the stacked vaulting that goes one at a time, to make kind of like an arch. But it's still using gravity, or at least gravity has a great deal to play in this kind of architecture. It's not open in terms of what we're going to see from some of the European examples of conscious architecture. And this is another ground plan. It's very simple looking, in essence. The Sun Temple. And you can see the walls are massive. The entryways represent, in a sense, a human figure. And it's kind of like you are entering into this embodiment of your inner self. Everything that was created, once again, came from the intellect and the genius and the feeling and the integration of human beings who were able to use the geometries and the proportions that were passed on from one generation to the next, from master to student and on down, even to the present. There are still masters of this particular kind of geometry and art in India, if one should care to look for them. And here's another version of that same kind of development. It's a hallway with, of course, this stacked dome, almost like a layered cake. Some have called it, but it's not. It's basically based on the elevations of the different levels of existence, the realms of different levels of gods and divinities up to the absolute God. It's in the shape of a mountain, in the form of a mountain. Here's another one. Once again, there's elaborate groupings that surround a main figure. And we'll see that later in some of the work that goes a little bit further east from India, some of the great examples of architecture that developed. But India is basically the seed source of the architecture that goes into the Far Eastern countries where Indian missionaries and Hinduism and then later Buddhism was planted. And we'll show you an example of this. Now you can see here this incredible temple complex houses the different deities going all the way up to the supreme god on top, which could be Shiva, could be Vishnu, but it doesn't really matter. This represents the hierarchical structure of the thought of the religion in this part of the world. The idea of gods, and the supreme god, then there are other gods below, and then demigods and so forth, to the level of the human beings walking at the entryway to the temples and going inside. They are all basically providing force for the adoration of the deity and for the, I guess, working toward creating enough merit to rise above having to come into a recurring kind of existence, reincarnating over and over again into the same type of life, into the same type of experience. And so these different levels represent the possibilities that exist for humanity. And this is all connected, by the way. The architecture in India has not been divorced from the philosophy and the mystical teachings. So the mystical teachings go hand in hand with the architecture, with the art, with the music and dance, and with any kind of activity, actually. And so, in effect, India has continued to be more or less the motherland of all religious and spiritual thought. It still welcomes new versions of arriving at divinity, and it is in fact a positive culture in terms of that there is a positive attitude toward spiritual evolution, toward conscious evolution, which unfortunately in many other cultures is lacking. But in India, it is in fact the foundation of the entire culture. And then we come to a very simple beginning design. And so we've gone to a very complex version of Indian temple building, but here is a very simple one. It's a lantern tower, a temple of Shiva, and you can see that basically square blocks are put across one another, and they go higher and higher as a result. It's called a lantern tower. And I don't know if you can see something like this. Once again, but it's very square. It's built on the square, and you can see the actual feel of this is square once again. Indian architecture is very solid in its principles and regulated, although the elaboration in terms of the final product is allowed free rein. So there's a lot of structure, and yet there's a lot of improvisation allowed in terms of creating the final piece in terms of architecture. But this is a mandala, as you can see. The actual ground plan is a mandala. When you walk into it from the four directions, that in fact represents the four states of existence, and everything in the architecture is intended to elevate the mind, to release the mind from worldly cares. You are in a sacred sanctuary that is basically beyond everyday life when you enter these precincts. And this is a Buddhist temple, and I think at this point we're going to stop and allow Deborah Judith now to create an invocation to this magnificent architecture and art that we've seen, and we're going to experience through the music some of the images that we've all been exposed to. Thanks, Deborah.
Thank you.
Mm. You're welcome. Thank you.
Good night.
We'll see you next time.